Hello guys, so we're on to Love's Philosophy now. I hope you're all okay in isolation. It seems like this week has been, it's been months has gone by, but we realise it's only been just about 7 days. Anyway, hopefully these annotations, as I've said in most videos, hopefully they're helping. More than welcome to get some feedback. I'm glad that I've got few viewers, few subscribers. Clearly it's helping someone regardless of the absence of comments. So anyway, let's get stuck into this poem, which is Love's Philosophy. If you are following my videos religiously, or if I teach you, you'll know that I am thinking that this poem, Love's Philosophy, compares really well with Sonnet 29. Sonnet 29. There's other poems which this could compare with, as I've said in my other videos, but for me this is the perfect match. Now the tone in this poem, we'll actually come back to deciding the tone, just because well, I just want to kind of switch it up a little bit. So this is actually one of the easiest poems, weirdly. You wouldn't think so, because it kind of talks a lot of metaphors, and it's a bit outdated. It's not a modern poem, but if there was one of the poems that probably is, I'd say, is the easiest, it would be this one. So for those who struggle a lot with analysis and things like that, this is one to kind of start with, so that and it's easy to kind of talk about and gain lots of meaning from it. Okay, so Percy Bysshe Shelley, I believe that she was married, he was married to Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Fun fact, not at all any importance there. You do not need to make that connection. Potentially though, however, you could make the connection that it is the Victorian period. Okay, so I'm going to put that down here, Victorian era. How could that be significant? To be honest, once again, like the other poems, you just got to remember how laws and societal rules, cultural rules were a little bit different. But there's not going to be much Gothic link here, whereas, you know, poems such as the Robert Browning poem, that there was a bit more of a Gothic genre to it. One thing that you do need to know, that during the Victorian era, there was a continuation of the love and fascination within romantic poetry or romantic poets. So Percy Shelley, he was a romantic poet. If you remember, actually I've got it right next door to me here. If you remember in When We Two Parted, where Lord Byron was also a romantic poet, if you've watched this video, I said the importance of understanding like who these romantic people actually were. It's not to say that they were obsessed with romance or anything. They were just fascinated with the idea of kind of the open space of life. They were against societal rules. They were against social status. They were hippies of their time, and they genuinely believed that love, emotion, nature kind of overrides everything. Quite philosophical, actually, stated in the title as well. They were people who did look at philosophy, so you could make that connection as to Percy Shelley being the title's quite typical of a romantic poet, because they were very much fascinated with the emotion of love, and also the philosophy and unique ideas, which were not confined to the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution, a way that we should and should not act. So, moving on, Percy Shelley was actually from a wealthy family, regardless of their his fascination within kind of freeing themselves from kind of societal rules. I guess that he wanted to break away potentially from this kind of wealthy restrictions that he personally had, and obviously if you're brought into a rich family like the royal family, you'd be expected to act a certain way. Since he is a romantic poet, it suggested otherwise. It suggests that he actually was someone who wanted to break away from the norms. So you could argue maybe there's an element of, personally, Shelley wanted to kind of reconnect with what's actually important in life instead of just society. Okay, so now in this poem, Percy Shelley, we do not know whether or not it is actually him. like his own experience that he's talking about. However, we could maybe justify a hypothesis that it is. He tries to encourage the lover in this poem into an intimate relationship. Of course, as I told you, to acknowledge the Victorian era, females were females and male, like their relationship were very sacred, sacred specifically to God. Still, it's still a very religious era, although there was the collision of you know, questioning you know, what is heaven and what is earth, because there was the whole development of science. However, here we can see that there's a need to, like, this Shelley, or maybe just the narrator, wants to encourage this woman in quite a naughty manner, wants to encourage the woman to have this loving relationship with him out of wedlock. So this would be seen quite sinful, quite naughty, just because he's wanting to encourage her to essentially disobey the laws of God, to make sure that obviously intimacy is only something kept to marriage. Now, bit of a tragic fact which links with his life, is that he was, like I said, he was a wealthy family. He was set to inherit riches upon riches. However, he was expelled from university, didn't enjoy it, didn't want to live that life, and he then got into the ideas of atheism. A lot of romantic poets, actually, if you remember me saying, and when we two parted, I was saying how they were even against of some religious laws and rules. The reason being is because, like King Henry VIII, or, you know, the Divine Rights of Kings, where the kings almost manipulated and abused the power of the church in order to control the masses, and they would claim that they had a right to dictate what people should and should not do, because the king was chosen by God. Because he was a romantic poet, he didn't believe in status. So therefore, romantic poets such as Shelley would be against the ideas of religion, because they didn't believe that it had a genuine meaning to it, and they thought that it was a bit corrupt. So it's not a great surprise that he was an atheist. Because of that, his father disowned him. Obviously, it would be seen almost devil-like to admit at the time of the Victorian era that you weren't into God or didn't believe God at all. So you can kind of connect the reasons and motives as to why he became this romantic poet. Perhaps he just didn't find a place in his structured life with his father, his riches, etc. And he wanted to kind of become more of like a Victorian hippie. Okay, so love's philosophy. Philosophy, if you understand the meaning, you might want to annotate it here. It's essentially a theory. It's a guiding principle. It's something which we can look upon and try and interpret whether we do or do not believe in the philosophy of a particular subject. So love's philosophy, this suggests, this title, that he's kind of interpreting the meaning and the genuine meaning behind love and what is actually important. So already we can see that he is started off wanting to persuade this female, or the narrator is wanting to persuade this female with an argument that despite the fact that they're not in wedlock, she should still consider their love. Because it's more about the principle of their love and less about the actual marriage itself. It's more just kind of like a why not, if it's meant to happen, is meant to happen kind of idea. Really simple. We've got 2 verses. We can say that the poem, because it's all about love, which we can link to the ideas of romantic poets always being very emotional, it's a lyric poem. Okay, lyric poems, they are very emotional poems. It's not a story, it's more of just a feeling. So unlike things like Porphyria's Lover, where there's almost like a telling of a story and linear structure of the events, here we have more of kind of like a open book kind of conversation with himself about the philosophy of love. It's a dramatic monologue, or it might be. So this is arguable, the fact that it's a dramatic monologue. Because the thing that would make it a dramatic monologue is if he was actually writing about this to Mary Shelley before they got married. So this might be maybe his kind of first temptations of marrying Mary Shelley. Okay, so the structure, now let's start with this. So the first verse, the fountains mingle with the rivers with the ocean, the winds of heaven mix forever, with a sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single, all things by a law divine, in one another's being mingle, why not I with thine? So we'll break this down and you'll slowly realise actually how easy it is to interpret. So the fountains is quite simply just using... he's using comparisons, okay? So he's saying the fountains, they mingle. Mingle means to converse, to have a conversation. So he's personifying the fountains mingle with the rivers with the ocean. So this use of personification allows Shelley, or allows the narrator, to encourage this female to understand his argument. So personification... it is used as a persuasive technique. And this is why. So he's essentially saying, look, the fountains are having a conversation with the rivers with the ocean, the winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. Nothing in the world is single. So he's saying that all these natural things, they don't work alone. They're not things that work separately, independently. They are dependent on one another. To suggest that nothing in the world is single, to suggest that he is dependent on love. All things by law divine, and one another's being mingle, why not I with thine? So essentially he's using these natural things, these things of nature, linking very much to the romantic poetry, to basically say, look, if nature's doing it, then of course, if we're a part of nature, it's not unnatural to want to be together. Okay, so the personification here is a persuasive technique because it allows the reader, or the female, should we say, it allows the female to make a connection between nature and their relationship. I'm sorry about my horrible handwriting. Okay. You'd. Now, fountains, rivers, oceans. Okay, so... yes, with the sweet emotion. Okay, another thing that we could talk about is, and I'll highlight this, I'm getting out my highlighter now. Right, we've got the ideas of fountains, rivers, ocean, river. So all this natural imagery, nature imagery, which I'll highlight once again here. It shows how their love is natural. It's something which is inevitable. And of course, by using this semantic field of, or lexical cluster of words linked to the idea of nature, it makes the argument sound more credible, because it's saying, well, if it's inevitable, our love, then it's clearly something which is destiny and something which must happen. So it would almost make the female feel illogical, feel delusional or illogical to go against the idea of those two matching. Okay, so he uses a lot of very clever techniques and devices. You could say or annotate on your page that the devices are used to form an argument. The devices are used to form an argument to persuade their love match. Okay. All right. So there's a gentle blending of the nature imagery is also very soft. So it's to suggest perhaps that, you know, there's a very positive, peaceful kind of connection between them two. There's nothing negative. It's not like in the romantic relationships that you get in Farmer's Bride, completely contrasted to that. It's not like neutral tones, which I've yet to come across with you guys yet, or some of the parent relationships, which is a bit more morbid and depressing. It's once again a very, very happy relationship, which is why it connects nicely with Sonnet 29, because the tone, we can start to write this now, is positive. You could say it's argumentative. Actually, I'll change that. Persuasive. Positive and persuasive. Okay, so now we go down to this rhetorical question. So once again, in connection to my ideas that I'm encouraging you to understand is the persuasive techniques used here in order to encourage her to want this love match. Now he uses, once again, and remember this for your language paper 2, some of these devices are things that you can actually use, because there's moments where you have to employ persuasive techniques. Here this writer, Shelley, has used the use of rhetorical question. The rhetorical question here makes that reader, or makes the female who's reading it, think and maybe question themselves, change their ways. So think about as many different purposes of this technique. We then move on to the second verse. See the mountains kiss high heavens, and the waves clasp at one another. No sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother. And the sunlight clasps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What are all these kissings worth, if thou kiss not me? So he's saying, basically, ultimately, this is summarising, saying, like, look, if you don't want this to happen, then what is the point of nature? What is the point of anything continuing if we're not doing what nature is asking us to do? Okay, so I want to actually make that, and I kind of thought of this now. There is, instead of saying, which would be typical at the time, instead of saying religiously, oh, God has chosen us as two couples, we're destined, we need to get married and, you know, say our vows, etc. He has prioritized, as a romantic poet, he is saying that nature has chosen us instead of God. So nature has chosen us, not God. So you could connect that to the idea of AO3. The fact that you could connect to the fact that he's an atheist. You connect it to the fact that, not God, romantics. Okay. Now, look how the nature imagery, it changes. So we've got mountains, heaven, moonbeams, sunlight, earth. Now think about what happens. I'll give you a little thought there. So look at the objects here, or the nouns here. You've got fountains, rivers, ocean. Then it changes to the mountains, heaven, sunlight, earth, moonbeams. It's taken a shift, okay? So you can say the nature imagery has essentially like grown in size. Because you have the smaller objects here, or the smaller nouns here, which is just river, the simple things, but then it goes even bigger. We're talking about the big mountains, heaven, which would be, you know, well, infinite, if you do believe in heaven. Sunlight, of course, now we're going out of space, we're going somewhere beyond. It could show how their love has no boundaries. No boundaries. It could link to the fact of his growing affection for her. Growing affection. If you have made the link already, I'm starting to think about one that links this to... what was it? Mother Any Distance, where there was, he started off with kind of being in his room, and then he slowly took that spacewalk, and then he went to fall or fly. There was also the growth of kind of him wanting to pull away. The same way there's this growth of feeling, this growth of emotion that progresses throughout the poem. So you could connect how the nature imagery has grown in size as the poem moves on. Okay, that would be a structural comment. You could use really good words such as the poem shifts from one verse to another, you recognise how the nature imagery has grown in size. This could connote or could imply that Okay, he becomes a bit more desperate as well, or he's suggested to really want and desire this relationship through the verbs such as clasp. He's gripping tightly, and kiss. Okay, so he's actively wanting to do something. Okay, it shows his desperation, but his passion and ambition, his emotional kind of dialect or tone throughout this poem links to the idea of, once again, being a romantic poet. People were very emotional and very in touch with their with how they are feeling. Now, you would have noticed, or maybe you've noticed, me saying that he was an atheist. He would, so he didn't believe in God. However, he uses the idea of the winds of heaven mixed forever, and then he repeats heaven again down here. I put that the religious imagery, it might be, well, it is ironic, the fact that he's atheist and yet he's using religious imagery. However, it could be used here to suggest that nature in some ways has allowed them to kind of have a pass in some ways. You don't have to believe in God to make your relationship heavenly. So it could be a metaphorical term relating to their divine, their superior romance, their thing which is above anything else, that their holy relationship, but with no need for God's approval. He might be, maybe, there's a sense of him wanting to, if it is, we're not knowing who the narrator's actually speaking to, but presuming it might be Mary Shelley, Shelley could be saying this in order to encourage her, once again, another persuasive technique, a persuasive device, which is used here, the religious imagery, to make her kind of make that dream of their romance sold, because at the time it was very religious, so he would in some ways had to kind of advertise who he was and his image to her, and of course the best way to do that at the time where religion was so profound, he might be using this idea of heaven and his beliefs of God as a way to kind of almost entice her. Okay, you've got the ideas of his question. You could connect this to AO3 and the idea of him, yes, this persuasive technique, him almost wanted to take charge of her in some ways. So you could connect it to the man being in control and quite domineering in this perspective. He's being quite pushy, not really giving her much of another option. He asks loads of rhetorical questions, suggesting that she's not allowed or he's not permitting her to answer. You could maybe mention that to hit AO3 for the exam. Other things which I'll really quickly cross over is enjambment. Enjambment's also here. It's where there's no punctuation at the end of the line and it just swoops down to the next. The enjambment could represent their ongoing love, his endless love for her, continuation of him pursuing her. Okay, so yeah, so the repetition I put down here, repetition structure shows he's demanding. Yes, if you have any other questions, like I always say, please ask me. But thank you very much. Have a good day, guys. Bye.